Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here. And I want to thank Yasufumi and Mirza and everyone else at the Asia Society who made this program possible. It's wonderful. They made our lives easy, which is always a good thing to do. And I want to congratulate Joan, actually, on the publication of her book, The Geometries of Afro-Asia, which you should all buy. And this is the occasion for this event tonight. And so I just want to start by going to your book, because your book sort of brings together two groups of artists and diasporas that we often don't think of together. Or if we think of it together, it's in really discrete moments and almost always in popular culture. And so I would love to hear, before we talk about the artists that you have that we're going to think about, the impetus for this book for you. What were you thinking? What were you thinking?
What were you thinking? This is a rhetorical question I ask myself all the time. So there are a couple of trajectories, and this actually gets to the question of geometry. My father worked for the World Bank, and his area of specialization was, in fact, looking at lending practices in Africa. So part of my childhood was spent in Kenya, in the Ivory Coast, and also Ghana. So the thinking of, say, Asian diasporas, especially in some places like Kenya, where, by the way, there were 5 Chinese restaurants whose matchbooks my mother would collect. And as they traveled all around the continent, she amassed something like 200 matchbooks. So I actually wanted to write a book about Chinese restaurants on the African continent, but that did not pan out.
I've been to 4.
So that was kind of a more biographical trajectory, but I didn't think about it in a systematic way until I took a class with Judith Wilson at Yale in 1995. But if anyone asks, it was yesterday. And one of the images that she showed was one of Howardina Pindel's assemblages. And she talked about Pindel having gone to Japan twice and actually staying for about 7 months in 1981. And this this led to another image that she showed of Raymond Saunders' work, where some of the images that Saunders brought into the work included restaurant menus, matchbooks, kind of bits and bobs that he had collected in Chinatown. And so this actually had me thinking that this is not just kind of a one-off, but there is a certain kind of ongoing trajectory. And so from that, Judith said that, oh, you know what, you should just go meet my friend Camille Billups. So I took the train down here, and Camille was, again, another kind of formative influence, because she had taught in Kaohsiung in Taiwan, and she had done an entire print series based on her experience there. But then she also talked about how she first came to printmaking. So some of her teachers included not only Romary Bearden, but also Krishna Reddy, whom some of you, I think, know quite well. And so in thinking about these kinds of constellations of artists and encounters, one starts to realize that this, in fact, is more or less a story of a world that has always existed. And so some of the images that we'll talk a little bit about today attest to that. But another a concept that I was very much interested in, and I'm trying to write a kind of a broader history of, is the idea of a global majority.
Yep.
Now, this is an idea that has multiple histories. So maybe the best iteration would be Malcolm X talking about the global majority is deprived of their human rights. But then we also have anti-communist resistance movements using that word to talk about the majority of the countries that have not yet achieved political independence. And then we also have ways of thinking about a global majority that really kind of tries to be as inclusive as possible by thinking about the majority of the people who don't have control over their day-to-day lives. So what would an art history look like if that concept of a global majority, however it's defined, became the center of gravity? And it would turn out to have a very different kind of, I think, effect on the way in which histories of art are taught. Because when you have a survey of modern contemporary art, there's a certain kind of repetitiveness in terms of some of the artists that are mentioned, when in fact some of the more important, or at least to my mind, more significant relationships are, again, friendships. I think there's a real case to be made of looking at theories of friendship, people who live together because of circumstance, for example. So.
Yeah, I mean, and so often it's, what we say to each other, right, is what did someone read and who did they know? Or what I do when I open a book is I look at the acknowledgments. Who did they know? Yours, we could read yours.
It's a quasi-psychological profile, the acknowledgments.
It is. But what is so interesting, and what your book brings out, and what we can talk about, is that the relationships between Asian artists and Black artists and of African descent, Asian descent, they're reciprocal often. And I think that so often in the history of looking at Black artists looking at Asia, we've always looked one way. And so the Studio Museum did a show a couple decades ago called Black Belt. And it was Black artists looking at pretty much Asian popular culture, where here we're looking at artists, and we can start looking at artists, sort of looking at Asian art, living in Asia, doing research, getting degrees in Asian art. And there's this whole terrain, and it's not just contemporary. And so, one example that comes to mind is Sergeant Johnson, who was doing this in the 1930s. And California, is a really unique case because of, its position on the Pacific Rim, and how all kinds of artists participated in the streams, cultural streams, object streams, et cetera, that were coming in and out. And so nobody's working in a vacuum.
Exactly. I mean, actually,
let's look at some art.
Let's look at some art.
Yeah.
So I keep thinking about this pairing. So on the left, and in some ways this is an homage to Afro-American, Afro-Atlantic histories, which originated in Brazil, came to Washington, D.C., and then eventually Los Angeles. And the work you see on the left was one of the works that was included in the original iteration. So it's of a Congolese emissary. So this is not a person who comes, this is not someone who's enslaved. He's coming in as an emissary of the Congolese ruler. And this is a work that was painted by a Flemish painter and later gifted to King Frederick III. One of the things that's always been very interesting is you see his face, and you see that the clothes aren't wearing him. So oftentimes when you want to tell if something looks good, you ask yourself, is it wearing me or I'm wearing it? And it's very clear he is wearing his clothes, the posture, the way he occupies space. Yep. And then on the right is a painting by of Ricci, an Italian artist, and it's of a different emissary. So this is someone that was sent by the daimyo of Sendai in Japan to negotiate a trade relationship with King Philip III. Now what's interesting is that this emissary ended up converting to Christianity at a time when his boss, the shogun of Tokugawa, had banned it. So, but again, as is often the case today, that trade relations are very important. But I wanted to bring this pairing up here, one that you notice the dates. So it's about roughly 30 years apart, which is maybe, it's not as significant a period of time as it perhaps now, but I'm looking at this as thinking about Afro-Asia through the lens of circulation, of, again, being emissaries, of having, say, reciprocal kinds of roles in a time when often the question of, say, being Black or being Asian may seem to be construed through only one kind of lens.
Yeah.
That actually gets me thinking about the Sergeant Johnson, Sergeant Johnson's work that you mentioned. So this is one of Johnson's earlier works. It's from 1927, and it's of his one of his neighbors. So this is a young Chinese American girl that his children played with in their neighborhood in Berkeley. And a couple things you might notice straight away. It's it looks, the color is sort of reminiscent of Celadon. Now Johnson had access to Albert Bender's collection. Some of you might know Bender as one of the founding trustees of SF MoMA. And Bender also had a very substantial collection of Asian art, mostly Buddha sculptures, and he also had a significant print collection. But going back to one of the questions that I think you brought up, Stephen, is thinking about Johnson as himself a very active participant in framing the possibilities for thinking about a history of Asian art that doesn't just stop in a particular year. That's something that's ongoing.
Right. Well, and that gets used in very personal ways. And so for someone like Johnson, he's looking at Asian art, he's looking at Latin American art as well, and all of these things that were available for him in the Bay Area at that moment. Right? And so he's looking at the people in his neighborhood, obviously, but in invoking people and objects, and sort of remaking them in ways that become black, which I think is really interesting. And if you think about it, all right, at the same time in the 1920s, we have black artists in the United States and in Latin America looking at Africa much more so than they were before. And so if one thinks horizontally, there is this looking out, and it's not just Africa. And in the way that we've been fed this is that it's Africa, it's Africa, it's Africa. But it's Asia, it's Latin America. People are looking everywhere.
Speaking of which, so this is not a work that's usually discussed when one thinks about Lois Mailou Jones. Never. This is a very early work that she makes before she goes to Paris. So Jones is she's from Boston originally, and she talks about again how the Museum of Fine Arts Boston is a real kind of I guess in some ways you might call it a reservoir of ideas. It's a place where she looks at something like, so this is based on a piece of Chinese embroidery in the collection, and what she does is she translates it using her own interest in color. So the actual referent for this work it looks quite different. But what's interesting is thinking about how Jones is in fact reframing embroidery. So it's not just, oh, I'm going to copy this image, but rather how do I reconfigure this image so that it sets maybe a reset point for a different history of Asian art, where the Asian art the Asianness of it isn't just bound to a geography or racial or ethnic background.
Right. Well, it becomes material. I mean, it reminds me, this might well be student work of hers, right? I mean, it was done when she was at the MFA school. She was at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And, and in that mode, there are so many things that artists are looking at, or that students are being told to look at, or, the entry in may be a gallery that isn't the gallery that one expects. I'm remembering, my own failed art career. And it was at Yale in the 1980s, or if you ask again, it's yesterday. And I was an art major, but I was taking Japanese art classes and looking at Hiroshige, and that was the basis for my own work. And here it was about, and I think it's true for Jones, and it's true for Sargent, and it's true for so many others. It's about melding. Right? It's about sort of pushing a material, pushing a motif, right? That actually matches the experience that you're having, right? And so we have the experience or the thing that we want to investigate, right? As an artist, as a writer, as a scholar, and oftentimes the embroidery in this case shifts the frame, right? It shifts the frame of reference to then sort of make possible something that wouldn't otherwise have happened.
I think the same could be said about this work too. So this
Yep.
actually, I'm very interested in this because in some ways, how do we look at this work as significant to a very different history of modernism? Its repetition is there, difference is there. So this is based on a woodblock print, again in the MFA Boston's collection. But what she's also done is to also add more repetition than the actual reference indicates. So thinking about how is it that Jones is looking at different bodies of work, but then thinking about, okay, so what can I do that will in fact support my interest in, say, color, which is one of the things that she's best known for. Jones also was very interested in Chinese woodcuts. Among the books that she talks about as having a real kind of real sort of impact is Pearl Buck's 1945 book about Chinese woodcuts. And so one of the other questions that when we look at Jones's paintings is to also think about how is it that she's drawing from all of these different kinds of sources, and in the process having us think about the history of woodcuts or woodblock prints differently.
And I mean, there's a really great question sort of to take that a step further about dissemination. Because while Jones is making her work, she's also teaching at Howard University in Washington. And she taught there for decades. And, within that university, the art department was looking at the world, and the department itself opened around 1924. The Howard University Art Gallery opens in 1928. So it's early, it's almost 100 years ago. And their program of exhibitions was international from the get-go. So much more than many other places in Washington, D.C. at the time. And so these kinds of things, Northern painting, Asian art, all of these things were coming into these spaces, and people were looking at them and learning from them. And so you've got that kind of dissemination as well, which I think is really important.
I think that's also the key point too, is that these are not just inert objects. These are always objects that in some ways are on the move, and in some ways are also incomplete. We can't just say that, okay, this is something that was made in 1925 and then we move on, but to kind of come back to it over and over again. I wanted to bring this up here because also in thinking about movement, so on the left is a photograph by the photographer Man Ray. So it's of a Afro-Asian Trinidadian dancer, Silan Chen, who in her day, she was it. So she, again, had a very storied career as a dancer. So her father was recruited to be an official in the Chinese Republic. Her mother was Afro-Trinidadian, and Chen was trained in the Bolshoi, of all places. Then she developed a strong interest in Central Asian dance, and again, she was a legend in her day. And then thinking about how Black artists also shaped the trajectory of different Asian cultural forms. 1959, she goes to Mao's China and starts to work with people like Sheng Jie, also considered a legendary figure in the history of modern dance in China. So there she is kind of in the foreground, demonstrating some moves to her colleagues there. So this is also, I think, another way of thinking about that question of dissemination, that it doesn't stay in one place, and that we have, say, from Trinidad to the Soviet Union, to Central Asia, to China, and then she comes back to New York, where she marries the first film curator at MoMA. So it's all this. Speaking of geometry. I mean, she also had affairs with Paul Robeson, but we're not going to get there. That's, so.
You're getting gossipy. So no, this is true though. But do you want to talk about? I mean, there are alliances, right? People visiting, people alighting, people sort of going to. I mean, I'm thinking of Third World Solidarity in the 1960s, 1970s. And a decent number of Black Americans going to China, going to Japan, going to Korea, and for long periods of time, or as sort of cultural emissaries, which I think is really fascinating.
I mean, Chen is certainly one of that number. So one of the things that she did was to stage dance performances, which would then raise money for progressive solidarity movements. One of the best known sort of meetings is called the Asian African Conference, sometimes referred to as the Bandung Conference, because it was held in Bandung, Indonesia, in 1955. And this was something that was that Chen was very committed to the project of that conference, which was fighting against imperialism, but also thinking about cooperation between all of the newly independent Asian and African states. Speaking of which, we can, speaking of different kinds of maybe solidarities and disseminations, I did want to flag Zoe Dusan. So Zoe Dusan is also one of my personal spirit animals, along with Silan Chen. Dusan opened one of the first and most important art galleries in Seattle. She gave Yayoi Kusama her first show in this country. So that's what you see on the left. Just as before, again, Kusama becomes a name.
Right.
And then on the right are three of the artists that she represented. And one of the things that has always struck me about that image is the intimacy between these three artists, who are all very close, they're all very good friends.
Right.
And so one of the questions I think you're getting at with solidarity is, how is it that solidarity becomes a fact when you have personal regard and trust among the participants?
And how do you move beyond friendship?
Yes,
Right?
that's it.
Which is one of the things that you think about a lot. Like, how do you get beyond alliance?
I mean, I think for me, one of the ways to think about getting beyond alliance is also taking disagreement seriously. So when bonds break, so that just being together is not enough of a goal, but rather about how is it that being together really compels you to take one another seriously, which means that person is not always going to agree with you. So how is it that you can coexist with somebody else while also respecting that that person may never see eye to eye with you on certain issues, which one of the questions that we might also think about in relation to someone like Samela Lewis. So you mentioned before the question of things coming together. And this is where I think it's important to think about how artworks come together and how that's been important for artists like Samela Lewis, who got her PhD in Chinese art history in 1951. She's the first Black woman to receive a PhD in art history in this country. And on the left is a work from 1962 called The Garden, which she made after living in Taiwan. You mentioned our Black artists having a commitment to different parts of Asia. Well, Lewis lived in Taiwan, and this is one of the works that she created. It's in some ways it reads something like abstract expressionism, but that's actually not her I guess sparring partner, if you will. It's really calligraphy. And one of the proposals Lewis made, which was very controversial in her day, was the idea that Shang bronzes. So the work that you see on the right, that's in the collection of the National Museum of Asian Art. I am certain that she has actually seen this. It was in her original dissertation. And she saw this and made an argument saying that this bronze is analogous to bronzes that she had seen that were of African origin. Now, it's not quite accurate in this case because, as you know, with the ears, by the way, zoology is very important. The ears are not those of an African elephant. They're smaller, they're not as big and feathery. But she was really onto something because there's been recent research that says the lead isotopes of bronzes found in Africa are the same as those that were found during the Shang Dynasty. So in other words, there's scientific evidence to buttress a claim that when Samela Lewis made this claim, people just said, you're just out of your mind.
They did not take her seriously.
I mean, I think this is important too.
Yeah. No, it's true. But then, how does she sort of take the research right? And then sort of move it into her practice. What do you think of that?
I always thought of Lewis using her research almost as an angle on which to think about painting without having to adhere to what it is that everyone was telling her painting was. So, she's working in 1960s. So, the idea of, say, a New York art world that you have a handful of very, very vocal, very dominant critics who are saying that painting has to be X or painting has to be Y. And Lewis actually talks about this in her interviews, that having studied Shang bronzes, that allowed her a certain measure of freedom from having to align herself with a very kind of narrow view of what painting should be.
So then what we're talking about, and I think that so many artists and scholars and curators are coming at this from different angles, is an opening up modernism, right? That what we're suggesting, what the work suggests, if one, so often I just tell, when I used to teach, I would tell students to follow the artist. Follow the artist. That's what we do. We follow the artist, right? Not to get to intention, right? Because with many of us work with living artists. If I want an artist intention, I'll ask an artist, right? What do you want to do? What were you thinking? But to look at the trail, right? And it's coming back to that question of what did you read? Who did you know? What did you see? To think about, in this instance and other instances like it, how you can create a different trajectory, right? And we're talking about Lewis sort of not being constricted to, say, New York school painting or abstract expressionism or, things that were happening in the early 1960s other than that. And that the research starts to help her forge a different path, right? And artists of color were doing this all over the place. Their trajectories were different, and it's like a Venn diagram. And I'm taking you all back to Math 101, right? The Venn diagram, like this. And there are things in the middle, right? That are both. And so we're not ever talking about either or, but we're talking about a both and. That then allows a different lens.
I also think that Lewis, what she was also getting at was, how do we proceed from a position of abundance rather than scarcity?
Yep.
Because if you have canons, if you have institutions saying only this qualifies as good art, that's a scarcity mindset that says only a few people get to be in the museum or get to be acknowledged as artists. And I think that Lewis is saying, well, no, actually, we have to start from this position where that question of who gets to be known as the great artist is always an unsettled question, maybe not even a valid question.
And it's not pie. There's enough for everybody, right? But I think you're right. And I think that if we then look at this sort of the great landscape, right? If we then look at, I think we were talking upstairs about, say we're talking about the Renaissance, and asking what it would look like if you looked at the Italian Renaissance from North Africa. What would that look like? What if we looked at modern art in the United States from the vantage point of this combo? What if that were at the center? What would the world then look like? What would be at MoMA?
I'm not going to answer
Y'all
that.
laughing.
I
Y'all
have
are
no
laughing.
comment. No comment.
But
Yes,
it's a serious question. Like,
Or,
what
or,
would it look
or
like?
to look at Bill Pajot's work.
Yeah.
So Bill Pajot, based in LA, very much known for his work building the collection of the Golden State Life Insurance Company, which was created because insurance companies wouldn't sell policies to Black Americans. Pajot called himself, he actually regarded himself as a Chinese ink painter. So when he was growing up, he saw watercolors and he said, you know what, that is something I'm interested in learning. And one of the things that's very interesting about Pajot is that he approaches the question of, again, thinking about ink painting from a position of humility, not, oh, I'm going to learn this and then I'm going to master this. He has the opposite of that attitude. And so one of the things that's been very interesting is the range of his brushwork, and going back to the questions of affiliation or of being together.
Yeah.
You know, Tyrus Wong, who is best known for being the creator of Bambi, was a very close friend of his.
But also there's that geographic piece. You know, what does modernism look like from LA? Or from, the Golden State Life, which in this collection was amassed in the 1940s, 1960s, in a building that was designed by Paul Revere Williams, who was a black modernist architect. And so that world, which was modern, looked really different. And so, at its base, the question that I will bring, that I tend to bring to something is, if X were Y, how would it look? What does it look like, right? And so, what does it look like when we bring these sorts of things into conversation with what we think of as standard accounts of the modern or 20th century art? Because these things are still, so often just sort of, I wouldn't say cast aside. You can't cast something aside that you've never looked at, right? And so
I don't know. I know some institutions that have.
Oh, you do. but it's the what happens when you start opening lens or thinking of other kinds of agency. The agency of looking and the agency of affiliation and the sort of vectors that are different, vectors that go in different directions, that maybe don't involve the Atlantic so much, but we're talking about the Pacific. Speaking of
Yes. So this is Phil Ross Hines. So he was a member of Spiral, was active between 1963 and 1965. And he refused to be in the Whitney show of Black American artists on the grounds that he wanted to pursue universalism, for which he was very, very heavily criticized. But one of the things I did was writing this book is also to sit in on classrooms that taught some notion of art history, and not based in the United States, but in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, and South Africa. And I was very struck by the recurrence of the word universalism. One of the reasons being is that, again, that students were saying, why do I have to qualify everything I do because I happen to be from Africa? I want to have my work taken seriously. I want my work to be universal. So it's not the kind of the imperialist idea of universalism. I want to impose my ideas on the rest of the world, but rather I want to be relevant, or I want my ideas to have universal import. And I think that's what Hines is getting at.
Yeah.
I mean, with this work, so it's Japanese landscape. And so what he's done is to abstract different painting landscapes that he's seen, and they're staggered. Right? So it's almost as if he's cut different landscapes and collaged them together. So that what results is a more kind of, again, expansive view of ink painting at a time when ink painting was largely seen as a static source. You took from it, you borrowed from it, and you don't really credit it, and you say that, that you're supposed to be an amazing abstract expressionist. And Hines is saying, no. Let's actually look at where does ink painting place us as a viewer? Right? So how is it that how is ink painting constructed? What do we make of its apparent flatness? What do we make of the fact that it may not have many colors, for example? It's
So then, are we talking about changing? Sort of thinking about ink painting itself in a different way. I mean, are we talking about stretching our definition of what it can be?
And
Yeah.
I definitely think so.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think that's also a really interesting point you've brought up too, is how is it that if Asian art might be considered a black message, how is the blackness about that elasticity, that flexibility, that kind of pulling at the seams of something that, again, that really doesn't have a fixed definition. So, yeah.
Well, it unmoors this sort of if we can ascribe this is gonna sound, if we can ascribe ethnicity to form, which we do all the time, African mask, right? Do we then start to decouple when we see this sort of thing, when we see artists, and going both ways, this is not unidirectional, when we see artists sort of playing with these forms that are so strongly identified with a certain place or a certain people, does that start to sort of nip at the edges?
This is where we could get to the next
Okay.
sort of images. So this is another Heinz work. This work has certain analogs, thinking mostly of Korean artists, that Heinz was not aware of. But the resemblance is so striking that it really, in some ways, compresses what we might think as an insurmountable distance between, Asia and America. That it's almost as if this work is a traveling companion of some of the ink painting experimentation taking place in Korea at precisely the same moment. So in thinking about decoupling, I think about it as how is it that an artist like Heinz is just really kind of cutting across histories that we see running in parallel, in the same sort of decade or century, but we don't necessarily see them together, and Heinz kind of cuts across those lines.
Did you then think that someone like Heinz is sort of instructing us to look horizontally?
I think so. I think so. It kind of also reminds me of someone like, Oscar Hitchens. So Oscar Hitchens is considered, there's a pejorative term, outsider artist. He's self-taught. He's from Mississippi. He only started painting after he was 68 years old. So this is called Japanese symbols. And I think one of the things he's really getting at, because he talks about, I paint for ordinary folk. I paint what ordinary folk look at, what they like to do, what they like to see. And what I think he's really doing is also saying, yeah, just because I live in a particular part of the world doesn't mean my mind isn't cosmopolitan, doesn't mean my interests don't rove all around the world. And so I think it was very deliberate that he named this work Japanese Symbols, which, when you look at it closely, it's really kind of a convergence of different motifs. He collected lacquer. So there's wooden figurines. So in many ways, it's almost kind of I think, really sort of demonstrating the fact that the idea of outsider art is really a misnomer, that we have to also figure in this kind of cosmopolitan awareness.
I think that's absolutely true. And that it doesn't happen just in New York, in LA, and Chicago.
Mississippi.
Washington, D.C.
That's also true. Albeit that might be harder to sell. A couple, should we go through some slides, perhaps?
Yeah, let's look at some more.
So one of the works I was really interested in, too, was Faith Ringgold's reworking of the relationship between image and text that is so central to ink painting. And so one of the things you have here, you have trees, and then you have inscriptions that are written vertically. But they're usually taken from a poem or a speech, or it's an excerpt of a very well-known paragraph or essay. So this, for example, the words that you see kind of almost like rain in a way. So it's a quote from Shirley Chisholm from 1971. And what she's really looking at here, Ringgold is doing, is taking the idea of Chinese landscape painting and really using it to recontextualize the question of an American political landscape.
Yep.
So using format to make a certain problem feel, again, maybe not new, but to reactivated, so to speak.
Yes.
So this is another work that she did. She called them political landscapes. And so one of the things you notice is that she really does adhere to the format, again, of, so all the words are very painstakingly written from top to bottom. So that forces you to really slow down the pace of reading. It's not left to right. You really have to almost sound out the words in order for them to make sense. And then in 1972, so she goes to, travels to Amsterdam. And I think that the age of jet travel, I feel like that should be the real story of globalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Ringgold goes to Amsterdam, goes to the Rijksmuseum, and is really struck by the Tibetan tankas, the wall-mounted paintings that are often used for meditation or for devotional practices. And she uses that format, again, to kind of push what she did was those political landscapes, and then use the frame of the tanka, the cloth frame, to, again, I think, kind of give what it is that her political interests were a real sort of presence or heft.
And to recast them.
Yes.
It recasts them.
Yes. I wanted to also bring up the work of Evangeline Montgomery. I mean, Montgomery is probably best known for, she was the Arts Commissioner of San Francisco in 1967, the first Black woman to have this position. But she had a very, very strong interest in Asian woodblock prints, but also cutouts. And we talked a little bit about how is it that different approaches to thinking often were kind of converged in artwork.
Right, right.
So on the right, so this is an artwork that is in a collection in Detroit. And you notice that there's red, black, and green. And red, black, and green, of course, being the colors of Marcus Garvey, on a carved box that takes both from what she saw of Chinese incense boxes, but also what she saw of her mother's collection of African wooden carvings as well. So it's a real kind of, it's a work that has to be seen through all of those different angles in order to make sense. On the left is David Hammond's Afro-Asian Eclipse, currently on view at MoMA. And the other two works that you see on the right, so I'm bringing them together because what Hammond's is doing is taking the hanging scroll format. So one of the kind of major formats for painting in Asian ink painting, and really emphasizing its materiality.
Yeah.
So in the middle is another hair scroll that he did. My guess is he did at least 4 of them, but I can only find 2. And then on the right is his very well-known work, Nap Tapestry. And all the hair was hair that he had sourced from barber shops in Harlem.
Right. And there were barbers who did not want him to take that hair. There were a couple that turned him down. But it is, I mean, what do you make? Let's talk about the hair, these bodily pieces, and the scrolls, which are happening after his body prints. Right, David Hammond's 10 years earlier was making life-size prints of his body when he was living in Los Angeles, and they, in a way, present at least in terms of their scale and their shape, very similarly to these scrolls. And so again, I'm curious about that sort of melding of a kind of form that sort of speaks to one of the things he's already doing. Right? The emphasis on materiality, but also then hair, which is one of the most personal materials, right? And cast-off hair, and hair that at least in Black contexts is really important and really charged. And Nap Tapestries was really charged when it came out. I mean, a lot of Black people didn't like it. We're like, this is it's not art. It's not it's not a painting. It's not what we think about. It's not respectable. And he's bringing all of these things together to sort of really break up, what the artwork could be, alongside of conceptual artists, as a conceptual artist, who are working with different kinds of things, but are in many ways looking more narrowly.
So Hammonds has said that his interest in Asia was through Senghor Ngugi, who we can talk about in a little bit. And they also had gone to the Field Museum, and they had seen a robe from originally sourced from present-day Cameroon. And there was hair contributed by every member of a village. And Hammonds has talked about how when he saw that, shivers just went through his body, because even though this is a robe that was from the early 20th century, it had lost nothing of its resonance. And so I'm also thinking about how is it that these works are also alluding to a much longer lineage that, again, makes all of these smaller conversations, or not smaller, more recent conversations about conceptual art, not necessarily petty, but not as significant as sort of a much longer arc of time.
So but it just, I would say narrow.
Narrow,
right? That again, if we're thinking about vectors and roots and roots, that there are more of them than we have often acknowledged. And looking here, we start to then think about the kinds of ways that artists were doing this, and part of it is geographic location. I mean, not only traveling to Asia necessarily, but also traveling around the U.S. And a lot of this with Hammonds, I mean, he's working in L.A., in the late 60s and early 70s with people like Ngudi, Betty Saar, people who are really, Joe Outerbridge, and looking at Watts Towers, which, for those of you who don't know, which is this sort of incredible, intense, sort of architectural phantasma that was made by an Italian artist, Italian-American, Sami Rodia, in the 1930s through the 1950s. And he painstakingly sort of took broken bottles and whatever he could find and glued it onto these sort of marvelous constructions that he did. And these artists were all sort of living around that, looking at it, studying each other. And then looking, bringing these, Hammond starts to bring these kinds of things into
That's, also, I think along similar lines, I think about, Camille Billups going to Kaohsiung in Taiwan, or Howardina Pindell, and you notice there's a little red seal. So her name is spelled out in Korean characters in the lower right-hand corner. So one is that they're not seeing these categories of, this is Asian art, this is American art, this is modern art. These are artists that are muddling those boundaries. A couple of other ones.
We should talk about Pindell.
Yes.
Let's talk about Pindell.
Because I have been told by, I'm not going to name names, but certain, again, people who fancy themselves Pindell scholars tell me this is a minor work. Which is, to me is always like, oh, that's red flag in front of a bull. Minor? Excuse me, minor? Yeah.
Unpack that. Why?
So, why would someone call this minor, or why not? Well, one of the.
I'd let you get yourself into trouble.
So this is part of a longer series, the autobiography series, and she made this after spending 7 months in Japan in 1981, which is her second trip there. Her time in Japan was, how should I put it, a mixed experience.
It was difficult. Yeah.
Right after she came from Japan, she actually wrote, she actually had an interview, and she was very scathing about her time there. And it was an interview that was then translated to Japanese, that was never circulated in English. But one of the things that she did say was that she was just completely blown away by the architecture that she saw, the colors that she saw. And one of the, you notice that there's a lot of visual stutter throughout the image. So one way to also think about that too is, again, she's always having to kind of recalibrate herself wherever she goes, because people are looking at her. There are women who would scream and running out of the bathhouse because they thought she was a man because she had short hair. But on the other hand, she also talks about how she was able to see incredible things that you would never have been able to see otherwise. And I think of this work too as, how is this a reflection of the fact that vision is never straightforward, that you're always seeing, again, it's vision that's always compromised by intervals. You know, you're always having to look one way and look the other, and you can't ever get sort of a full picture. So it's one of the ways I think about this work.
But it's also, I mean, the one, and we haven't really talked about this so much with the artists that we've discussed. This is deeply personal. And I mean, you know, it's also a working through of trauma. It's, you know, Pindell's trauma of being in Japan, it was not easy. She sort of faced the same, you know, she faced the same kind of racism there that she thought she wouldn't, and that she was experiencing here. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of working through that in the series that she starts to do. And so she sort of draws out her own influences, sure, East, West, I'm here, I'm there, I'm multiply located. Yet at the same time, she's working through the experiences that she has. She's trying, I think, to make sense out of them. You know, it through form, through aesthetics, and through pushing the work.
You know, it's also interesting you mentioned that as well, because it's in many ways because of Pindell that, so in 1987, David Driscoll organizes the Art of Black America in Japan,
Yep.
which was very successful. And it was largely because of Pindell's advice when she said, oh, you know, you should be doing this to publicize your show. You know, this is the way you should be approaching, you know, certain people that would help the show, you know, realize its goals. And it actually got me thinking a little bit about another show which is less known, which took place in 1992, called, what's it called? Dream Singers, Storytellers. That was a joint production between the state of New Jersey and its sister, I guess, state in Japan, the Fukui Prefecture. And that show is very interesting because it made no distinction to so-called formally trained and outsider artists, of which I think Hitchens, you know, we saw one example just before. And so one of the questions I'm also thinking about is, how is it that Afro-Asia also changes depending on the audience that you're talking to? So when I've been talking about Afro-Asia, every talk has been different, and sometimes dramatically so, because again, as you pointed out, you know, LA has a very different set of coordinates. You go to, you know, Singapore has a very different set of coordinates.
Yeah.
The same was if you go to, you know, Cape Town, it will have a very different set of artists that are more relevant, or maybe not relevant. You know, there's a certain urgency, present.
So that's true. But you know what do you make of, because, you know, coming back to your book for a minute, you look at the longue durée of Afro-Asians. So it's multiple, right? Is there a way that you would kind of draw a trajectory? Do you think that it's a kind of trajectory, or do you think it's more discrete moments, or do you think that it's something in between?
I probably think it's something in between. I know that's a cop-out answer.
No, it's not.
But one is, I think that every artist whose work is really thinking seriously about the directions that Afro-Asia presumes is thinking both very, very long-term, but also thinking about, say, the immediate present. So in other words, that you have to kind of work between multiple scales, which is, I think, what's both Senga Ngudi and Alice Nassar are doing here. So on the left is Ngudi's work. It's a detail from her work, Temple, from 1993. And Ngudi calls this as, this is a convergence of her interest in Asian, African, and African-American ritual, so that you have long paper strips kind of hanging down. She talks a great deal about how drawn she is to Japanese paper, because for her, this is something that just, in her mind, lives forever. And so that idea of immortality also becomes something that's quite relevant, that the work might, you know, burn or disappear or be dismantled or, you know, be lost, but the memory of having seen the work is something that lasts for a very long time. And I was thinking about it in relationship to Alison Sarr's work. So Alison Sarr daughter of Betty Saar. This is a work that's named after a Billie Holiday song called Travelin' Light, which also happens to be a very popular jazz standard in Japan. And you notice that a man, again, many sort of very troubling connotations immediately come to mind. So there's a man, bronze man, that's hung upside down,
Right.
but it's a bell. And so what Saar did was this is a work that's modeled after temple bells in Japan that are rung 108 times on New Year's Eve to rid the soul of its defiling passions, greed or selfishness and what have you. So that even though it reads as something that, again, alludes very explicitly to extremely traumatic history. At the same time, it's also a way to think about what are the possibilities of redemption. And she does this using the language of, again, temple architecture. So, yeah.
Emerging it with the figures that she long had been making in her work.
Questions. Now, I was thinking also too, because I'm very wary of the question of influence. You know, sometimes we like to think, an artist influenced by X, Y, and Z, and that's the whole story. And I don't want to imply that there's some kind of causality, because I was thinking about someone like Martin Puryear. So speaking of cosmopolitan, I mean, he got around. Sierra Leone, was it, I think, but Sweden. Japan, he got a Guggenheim to study landscape architecture in 1982. And the architect Fumiko Maki had asked a gallery owner in Tokyo for artist recommendations, and Martin Puryear was at the top of that list. So the building that you see in the background, for those of you familiar with Tokyo, so this is in Roppongi, and it's the Asahi TV headquarters. Big, tall glass building. And the work is called Guardian Stone, which is a name that is usually ascribed to the most important fixture in a traditional garden. So on the right, this is on the right is one of the more well-known examples. So it kind of holds court in the middle of a space. And the Martin Puryear's Guardian Stone has now become has landmark status almost. Like, people really kind of think of this stone as really sort of holding the energy of a certain space. But I was also thinking about how is it that this work is perhaps best theorized using maybe the language of modern Japanese architecture. So for example, when Puryear was part of the Whitney Biennial in 1979, the well-known Japanese architect Arata Isozaki was having an exhibition up at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Isozaki is very well known for his concept of of space, of the in-between, the question of the interval. And I've always seen Puryear's work as being able to just inhabit a certain space that, he talks a little bit about this is a shape that's in a space, and I hope that one day it might have a life as art.
Yes.
And I love the way that he kind of has that sense of, it's not just me declaring I am the one who makes this form, but rather how do I let a general we emerge because this form exists in the world. So there's a generosity to his thinking that I think is very much present.
So that, and this is, Puryear, 50 years, 40 years after he has gone to Sierra Leone, has really sort of studied Japanese materials. I mean, the wood, stone, all of these things. And so do you think that some of these things come about as the product of all of those experiences, of the engagement with the material, and seeing what it might do, and seeing how it affects us? Not unlike everybody else who things, right? But is there something unique about his different experiences? Because they're really they are super unique. It's the Peace Corps. It's a really serious immersion into Asian art and cultures. It's his experiences here, and his sort of formal trajectory through these different materials?
I feel like, for a lot of these works too, because they don't really settle into a particular shape. They're elusive to, some of my students say, oh, it looks like a comma, it looks like a hat. It's like, can you be a little bit more specific, right? But then I thought to myself, maybe that refusal to settle into certainty, that's what he's really getting at, was, all of these experiences. Like, it's not just, oh, I went here and this is how I shaped my thinking.
Right.
But also, how is it that what it is that I make allows for all of those other experiences to rise to the surface?
It threatens to be something
else. And also on that note, I did want to talk a little bit before we open up for brief questions, is to look, speaking of different parts we don't usually talk about, Houston. So the Houston-based artist, Jamal Cyrus. And Cyrus makes, these works that on first glance might look like abstraction of the kind that we're used to seeing as being described as high modernism. These are all made with denim and cotton thread. Now, what Cyrus is really getting at is he's getting at the practice of boro. So it's a Japanese practice of reusing, again, old materials. And there's a running stitch that's used. It's called sashiko. That's it's hard to do. Whenever I write about a work, I've always tried to make a miniature, just to see how hard it is. This is not going to happen. But one of the interesting things about the practice of boro. So, cotton was very expensive at one point in Japan, and it's a practice that was used mostly by working class families. And there's a saying about there's regret that comes out of waste, and how do you stem that regret? And Cyrus was very taken by this question of reuse and recycling. But what's interesting is that the cotton industry in Japan, cotton becomes more readily available in the mid-19th century. Now, where are they getting all their cotton from? Well, they get it from Britain, but they also get it from the US, and who is actually making that cotton? 1850s, where the approximate number of 3.2 million slaves in the American South, 1.8 million are involved in the harvesting and production of cotton. So there is also another link that I think Cyrus is really bringing out, that in some ways, could this also be read as, again, sort of almost an archive, or maybe archive is not the right word, maybe an homage even to that
historical
history.
narrative.
Yeah.
It's a historical narrative.
Can we see this as a history painting?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I can.
that's
I think we should open up
Yes.
for questions, yeah? Yeah, Yasufumi? Yes. So can we have the lights up, please? And so we do, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of our wonderful colleagues will give you a mic. Don't talk without the mic.
Hi.
Hi, Runa.
Hi. That was just fascinating, and I learned so much, and I'm so grateful to have been here to witness it. I was really fascinated, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm terrible at names, the dancer from Trinidad who went to China. And what was especially fascinating is that all of the other artists that you were talking about were visitors or somehow parts of communities, or looking at neighbors. But here's someone who, because of historical circumstance of how migration occurred in the Caribbean, was actually both things, right? Both Black and Asian. And that it seemed like a fascinating kind of sort of blip or exception in a way. And I was wondering, to what extent can we, I think about, say, Harlem, which had a large Bengali community, for example, and a lot of mixing between Black and Bengali people in that neighborhood. And I was wondering if there's more examples that you've sort of found of people who are sort of bringing those two threads together, not simply through sort of affiliation, but actually within their identities themselves. Certainly I can think of a lot of very contemporary artists, but it would be interesting if there are sort of earlier modern artists who were doing.
I'm thinking a lot about photography. Like, so for example, the works of, the Indo-Kenyan photographer Priya Ramraka. So someone who is based in Kenya. He comes to the United States in 1961, but someone who very much, again, sees himself as a member of the African continent, even though when he's in the United States, people don't recognize him as such. So that's one example. I'm also thinking about artists that have multiracial heritage. Actually, I'll show one more work because you mentioned Trinidad, which is awesome. So speaking of Trinidadian artists, so we've talked a little bit about today about Black artists having that affiliation, but we haven't really also talked about Black artists who live in Asia, and Marlon Griffiths is one of them. So Marlon Griffiths is Trinidad. I consider Trinidad under the larger rubric of America. And the work that you see here, so this was originally based on the Mas, or the Masquerade. And he's well known for works that incorporate elements of carnival, which was seen as anti-British at the time that Trinidad was a colony. But what he's done here is to restage that carnival in Korea at the Gwangju Biennale. That is an art event that happens every 2 years. That's, again, a lot of the works respond to the Gwangju massacre. It's a protest against the authoritarian government. And what happens here is almost kind of an embodied interest in thinking about how does living in Japan with a Japanese wife and children who are multiracial, how does this also apply to other parts of Asia? So in other words, cutting out the US and Europe middleman, so to speak, right? And so having these direct relationships. The point about Harlem, I think, is that someone needs to do a show about that. Speaking of really Afro-Asian locations, I think about Cape Town as well. So
absolutely, and Nairobi, and Mombasa, and many other places. But I'm also thinking about Jamaica. Albert Chong, who basically is of Asian and African descent, and he's been making work that takes both of them in for his whole career. It's 40, 50 years now. Oh, they took it away from you. Okay.
I was just thinking.
Lamb
I mean,
is a great
Wilfredo
yes,
Lamb, who's
absolutely.
such a fixture, really, at MoMA among other places, and we never think I mean, it's rare that people actually talk about the fact that that his background was Asian as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, Wilfred Lam show will be at Deja Society, Hong Kong, as a matter of fact. So, yes, we're right on.
I see a question up in the back. Oh, right
Testing
here. Okay.
one. Hi, my name is Theastra. I'm a visual artist. I live in Chicago. And
Hello.
I really wanted to thank you both for today. It was really amazing. I'm working a lot on Menge, and it was really beautiful to see Jamal's work and to think about Martin's commitment to the visual arts. But I've been thinking a lot about the relationship, kind of Menge as a protest or a resistance to not only westernization, but also like a kind of political and bureaucratic propaganda that keeps Japanese people, in the case Japanese women, keep folk country in a way, that we keep our provincial ways and we keep our Japanese ways. It's a resistance to the West, let's say, just generically. And then I'm thinking about that in relationship to the Black is Beautiful movement, another kind of resistance to, I'm not gonna perm my hair anymore. I'm gonna let my fro grow, and I'm gonna rename myself. I'm gonna spend time on the continent, kind of a back to Africa, and it feels like there's a a philosophical pairing of resistance, where in this case it's not about a black person being Asian or going to Asia, but there's a kind of collective resistance to an impeding imperialistic plowing that's happening, you know. And so I think that my preoccupation with Menge has everything to do with the way in which propaganda can be a useful tool for keeping one's national self or one's cultural self, one's identity. And I wanted to just kind of talk about that in relationship to Jamal's piece, especially, you know, and this idea, because I think that work falls beautifully within the realm of Menge. So I just thought I'd throw that out there for you both.
Great, thank you so much. You know, a couple of questions that Menge raises, because one of the other sort of trajectories that Menge also brings up is that was also a term used to put Koreans in their place during the Japanese colonial occupation. So one of, I think, the questions that you're getting at is thinking about how do we complicate the idea of the Menge, using, again, thinking about through works like, you know, your work or say Jamal's work. And I think that's actually important because that puts pressure on what it is that, say, art history might regard as central. So I think this is one of the things I think you're getting at is how do we produce a different kind of history of art from these artworks that have thought seriously about the potential for terms like Menge or you know, what Jamal is referring to and was Boro and Seshiko. What is he actually getting at? And I think what you're doing is also suggesting how do we not just think of this as technique or a style term, but what do we think of the politics that are embedded in those terms? And how is it that those histories have not yet been fully unpacked because of, say, certain pressures to, again, we just see this as, oh, this is just taking a craft technique, maybe he's like muddling the difference between art and craft, when in fact that muddling in and of itself alludes to a larger history of, you know, labor exploitation, of continued labor exploitation, and of histories that are embedded but are still very much present. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I always thought with Jamal's work, he's very, very good at making the stitching very visible. Like you see the work and you know that he was tired. He was exhausted by the end. So I think that's one of the points that you're really making. That's a really important one. How do we distill an art history from the way that artists, and Black artists in particular, use Asian terms or techniques or words that are sometimes just reserved to allude to a skill. So.
And I think a question in addition to that too is what does it activate? Like what does this coming together activate for the artist but also for the viewers? And what kind of, you know, I like to think of these things as kind of world making. And what is the kind of world that is being made in the space of these works or in the space of your work, right? And then how does that make us think differently? I think that's, you know, it's so much at the base of much of this work and other work.
Hello, my name is Nix. I'm a Jamaican and Chinese artist. Both of my parents are from Jamaica. My father is Chinese. And this was interesting. I certainly appreciate the talk that you had today, but I wish that you would have explored some more of the intersectionality between the two cultural groups, between Black Americans and even Asian Americans. Of course, Asians as a whole and all Black people in the entire world, they also have very different cultures, but a lot of the things that you presented were specifically Black Americans and more of a heavy focus on Japanese than Chinese or Korean. You did mention a couple, but there was not much Southeast Asian reference either. Right. So a lot of the things that I constantly have been inundated with my entire life was the differences between these two cultures and the intersectionality. Also equally important, as you just mentioned, the previous speaker had just mentioned. My question to you really is, how does colonialization, how does the imperialism, how does stuff like the Chinese Boxer Rebellion and the current exploitation of Asian labor reflect some of the other things that have happened to black people in America? Especially when you have things like internment camps that existed at one point in American history for Asian Americans. And currently we have internment camps for not just migrant people that try to enter the country, but also you could also make the argument that black people are in internment camps in the form of prisons and structured racism to ensure the limited growth of their culture. Meanwhile, Asian people are allowed to come into this country with their generational wealth. They're allowed to have ownership, and they're allowed to build. Two aspects of my family have been split across this diaspora, this different perspective. The Asian members of my family have been treated completely differently than the black ones, even if it comes down to how they look. And even within the family, there's a lot of colorism. I get preferential treatment over other people because I look more Asian and I speak Chinese. So all of these things also play into how Asian people view black artists. And you touched on some of these things also with some of the black artists that went to Asia and experienced racism and was like, well, shit, it's the same fucking thing as in America. And I'm dealing with this here. I thought that these people were gonna be different. Yeah. How does the colonization and that influence the colorism within the Asian community and Asian cultures across the world? And how does that common thread of stuff like the Chinese Boxer Rebellion, like I mentioned earlier, like Basquiat painted about this constantly, frequently. He would make references to that and the opium crisis and himself suffering as a drug addict. I saw this painting one day in a boxing gym in New York City, and I was like, these people don't understand the references that are being made. So really, I was asking you about the intersectionality, both the good and the bad, the internalized issues with both groups towards each other and how they're related through colonization and imperialism.
That is a massive question.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're asking the question of, you know, cultures, right? And how, you know, I mean, colonialism in different ways, shapes, and forms has structured everything, right? From how we are now, where we live, who we love, all of it. And I take your point, you know, about intersectionality. I think it's really important, and within families, throughout families, and I think that, you know, it's incumbent to try as often as possible to change the lenses, right? That one, you know, how can we understand the coming together in good ways and in bad ways? You know, how do we deal with fields that don't want you to air their dirty laundry? How do we understand the complexity? I think Aruna's example about Harlem was actually a very good one. I think your own example is a really good response to your own question about how intersectionality affects everything, right? How being mixed race affects everything. Well, I think it depends on the piece. I can't make a blanket, none of us can make a blanket statement for all of it. And again, it comes down to following the artist, right? And so, you know, it's going to be different. It's going to be different depending on the artist's own background, depending on where they worked, who they loved, where they lived. And so it's hard to generalize about that. It's impossible.
I think it's like the specificity. So, you know, one of the, and I take your point that yes, we did look mostly at Black American artists, but you know, the title is Black Artists Shaping Asian Art History. But I take your point about the East Asia, the focus. I didn't bring up someone like Carlos Villa. So Carlos Villa was a Filipino-American artist based in San Francisco in the 1950s and 60s, who worked very actively with, you know, he talks about the neighborhood that he lives in, where he is living side by side with, again, other, you know, other artists. I don't say artists of color, because artists of color is kind of a reactive term that basically grafts onto non-white. I prefer global majority, because that's also what Carlos Villa with someone that was someone that responded to this is, why is it that we're considered a minority when 85% of the world's population is either Black or Asian? It's still true today. And Carlos Villa was also very dark-skinned, so even among Filipinos, again, he was discriminated against. But one thing I did want to do was this talk is to get a little bit into the specificity of the artwork, because one of the things I've noticed is, and I don't know if that's true for you, Stephen, is a lot of the art doesn't get taken seriously. It's seen as, oh, this is representative of some kind of larger social problem.
Yeah,
And we don't
yeah.
attend to, again, the labor that's involved, what was the artist really kind of grappling with? What does he she or they are struggling with? What does it mean to take an artwork seriously? And I think that is a different question than the very important and large-scale question that you answered, which is a question I don't think we have enough lifetimes to answer properly. I mean, that's a very vast question. And thinking about, different diasporas coming together. What do you do with the population of Madagascar that is genetically Afro-Asian? Half of it's, the genes are from Bantu ancestry, and the other half is from Borneo. And literally the entire population is Afro-Asian. And that is a different set of questions about, different diasporas than I think the ones that you brought up, I would say you brought up, for example. So,
Joan.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.